Back in 2005, I wrote a book called A Brief History of Neoliberalism. Now, I don't really like to advertise publications, but it's rather important, I think, to imagine what has happened since I published that book. The main theme of the book was the way in which political and economic power had been mobilized in the 1970s to try to capture as much accumulation as possible and as much wealth and power as possible within the corporate class. And it was a state in which that successful project had worked itself out, and it seemed that there was very little opposition that was possible. Margaret Thatcher had this famous phrase, which was, "There is no alternative," Tina. She had taken the view that not only was she about to transform the economy, she wanted to transform people's way of thinking. And actually, in an interesting kind of way, the way of thinking that was being promoted was one of individualism and of self-improvement. We were all supposed to be entrepreneurs of ourselves. We were all supposed to invest in ourselves. Now, if we ended up in poverty, it was because we had not invested correctly in ourselves. So if we got into poverty, it was our fault. It wasn't the system's fault, it was our fault. The 1960s had seen a very strong movement of people wanting individual liberty and freedom and also social justice. And that movement of the 68 generation, if you want to call it that, which was antagonistic to what capital was about, was greeted by capital saying, we give you the individual liberty, and we value the individual liberty, and we will structure things around individual liberty, particularly in the market, so that you get lots of freedom of choice in the market, but you forget the social justice. That was the devil's bargain, if you like, that the 68 generation was offered by Reagan and Thatcher in the 1970s and 1980s up to the Clinton era of the 1990s. And I think by the time you get to the 1990s, many people have started to accept that if they were running into problems, it was their own fault, that the system was in fact going very well, and of course it was going very well for the ultra-rich. And the argument I would want to make is that neoliberalism did not end in 2007, 2008. What was lost was its legitimacy and its political legitimacy. And the discontent with the system was there, and the discontent became and has become deeper and deeper and deeper. In other words, people began to be alienated, if you like, from the whole system that was surrounding them. But at the same time, the system itself was not changing. In fact, since 2007, 2008, the rich have benefited immensely. They've used the doctrine of never let a good crisis go to waste, and they've actually used it to their own benefit. So if you look at the sorts of figures that you will see from Britain and the United States, you'll find that the top 1% has increased its wealth and power by, 14, 15, maybe 20%, while everybody else has either remained stagnant or lost. So that since 2007, 2008, the neoliberal project has not come to an end. In fact, it has continued. But it has continued under a situation where it is no longer illegitimate in the way that it was before. So a new form of legitimacy had to be found for the neoliberal project. And this new form of legitimacy is something which I think we have to pay very careful attention to. Now, in 2007, 2008, as I've suggested, there was this crash. The crash was in housing markets. Around 7 million households lost their homes in the United States. Now, when something like that happens, you would expect there to be a mass movement on the part of those who've been deprived of their homes. You would expect them to be out on the streets protesting and so on. Well, there was a little bit of that. But by and large, what happened in 2007, 2008 is that people who lost their homes blamed themselves, because that neoliberal culture that had been built up from the 1980s onwards, which was about self-improvement and investment in your own capital and so on, that was actually what was the problem, and people internalized it and blamed themselves.
I give way to the honourable gentleman.
There is no doubt that the Prime Minister has in many ways achieved substantial success for the economy. There is one statistic that I understand is not, however, challengeable, and that is that over her 11 years, the gap between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in this country has widened substantially.
That's right.
How can she say at the end of her chapter of British politics that she can justify many people in a constituency such as mine being relatively much poorer off, much less well housed, and much less well provided than it was in 1979? Surely she accepts that is not a record that she or any Prime Minister can be proud of.
Mr. Speaker, all levels of income are better off than they were in 1979. But what the honourable member is saying is that he would rather the poor were poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That way you will never create the wealth for better social services as we have. And what a policy! Yes, he would rather have the poor poorer, provided the rich were less rich. That is the Liberal policy. Yes, it came out, he didn't intend it to, but he did. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm extremely grateful. The Prime Minister is aware that I detest every single one of her domestic policies, and I've never hid that.
And I think that the honourable gentleman knows that I have the same contempt for his socialist policies as the people of East Europe who have experienced it have it for theirs. I think I must have hit the right nail on the head when I pointed out that the logic of those policies are they'd rather have the poor poorer. Once they start to talk about the gap, they'd rather the gap was that. Down here. That. Not that. But that. So long as the gap is smaller, so long as the gap is smaller, they'd rather have the poor poorer. You do not create wealth and opportunity that way. You do not create a property-owning democracy that way.
And there were plenty of people, of course, in the media and elsewhere who were ready to blame the victims. So what we had was a kind of a blaming of the victims. Now, when victims get blamed, there's always a residual of saying, well, am I really to blame? And there's a kind of discomfort and a feeling of inadequacy. And so the whole population that was affected by 2007 and 2008 was kind of left in limbo. They saw government attending to the bankers and healing the wounds of the banking industry, but they didn't see anybody coming and helping them. They saw instead actually an increasing politics of austerity. And the austerity for what? To pay off the bankers? Or to pay off the ultra-rich?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years, and we're very happy that we leave the United Kingdom in a very, very much better state than when we came here 11 and a half years ago.